Let's start with what I wanted to tell you, because I wanted to talk about Crystal and is it production ready yet? Recently I was asked whether or not Crystal is still alive, because it was hyped a few years ago and then nothing, like people forgot about it. But yeah, it's still alive and still doing pretty well. But you may be wondering, what is Crystal? Because you may have not heard about it. So Crystal is a programming language that was created over 3 years ago. And why bother talking about it, right? This is Ruby user group, not Crystal user group. There is not one for Crystal yet. But Crystal is interesting for 3 reasons which join together really nicely. The first one, it has syntax really similar to Ruby. Like really, you can sometimes take Ruby code and run it as Crystal. That's what they say in all those Crystal intros. But it's often false, then it's not always true, because when you Google any Crystal intro, they will show you some Sinatra code, which does like one endpoint and gives a response. And then they say, hey, look at this Crystal code. It's the same. Crystal is the same as Ruby. You can just go and try Crystal. It's not true. It just works for this one example. And if you want to do anything more complex, you basically have to read the documentation. But moving on, why is it different? Because Crystal is statically typed, while Ruby has dynamic types. What's the difference between those two? Well, static typing means that the program knows beforehand what kind of data it can expect in a given variable or in an array or anywhere, while if you use Ruby, right, you can create an array like this. So you put a number inside, a string, a nil, and then you can do things on this array, something like this. And it will not work, because you call next on each of those objects. So you can call next on a number, you can call next on a string, but you can't call next on nil. So you get no method error. But you get it after running the code, usually in production or somewhere, which is not good. So let's try and run the same code in Crystal. So we get the same code and we try to run it in Crystal and we get syntax error. Like this example is not more complex than the Sinatra one, but already we have different syntax. It complains about using double quotes for strings, because in Crystal when you use single quote, it means a character, not a string. Okay, this font is not supposed to look this way, because the arrow underneath the error should point at the string, which is a nice feature because it tells you exactly where the error is. So we change the quotes to double quotes and try running it again, because it should work now, right? Well, not, because now Crystal says that it expected a function, not a symbol, inside map. Because for some reason, Crystal uses dot notation, like you're calling a function inside map, not a symbol notation. The nice thing about this is that you can actually chain methods inside map, something you can't do in Ruby. So we use a dot here. And when we try to run it, we find out that Crystal actually doesn't have next method for integer. So we already have 3 differences between Crystal and Ruby. Okay, and this is a good place to stop and look at what happened here, because it says undefined method next for int, and then it says compile time is int or string or nil. Because Crystal is using something which is called union type. Because when you're programming in C, you can't easily put many different types in one array, right? You have either array of integers or array of strings or whatever. So here, it just says, okay, it can be something which is either an integer or a string or a nil. It creates a union of those types. So now, if we want to do something with this object inside an array, the method we're calling must be implemented in all of those three. So let's change this code to something that is actually valid in Crystal. So we will try to multiply the element in array by 2. And we know we can multiply integers, we can multiply strings, but we can't multiply nil. And if we run this in Ruby, it is valid Ruby, so the other way is easier. If we run this in Ruby, we will get no method error again during runtime. So it will multiply the number, multiply the string, and fail on nil. And Crystal also fails. It's an undefined method star for nil, but it happens at compile. Because Crystal is compiled, so it knows beforehand that something will break there. So it doesn't let you run the code. So what if we try to trick it and we create the same array as before, number, string, and nil, but then we change nil to string? Will it work now? Well, no, because during the array creation, during the initialization, the type was already decided. Like, it looked at it and said, okay, those are the 3 types that can be inside this array. So this map potentially cannot work. It can break, so it won't allow you to run this code. So we have the third thing, Crystal is compiled. Compiled is good because if you compile an application to binary code, it's usually much faster than languages like Ruby or Python, which are interpreted. Okay, so moving back to the original question. Is it production ready? And what does it even mean for something to be production ready? Okay, each of you can have different definition of software or framework or language being production ready, but it usually goes back to some basic things. Like, first, we want it to be fast to write. We want everyone, each of our developers, to be able to work with it, to create something with it, and we then want it to be easy to maintain. We don't want our framework to break every day or every week. We want to create an application and then don't worry about updating. Like, we want to update, but don't worry about updates breaking our code. So, is Crystal fast to write? Well, yes, it is, because it looks almost like Ruby, and we all know that Ruby is fast to write. It's fun to write. But is it easy to maintain? Is it stable? Well, if we look at GitHub, the latest release is 0.24, which doesn't sound quite production ready, right? And if we read the documentation, it says this project is in alpha stage, not even beta, it's alpha. So we can expect some breaking changes here and there, right? Well, yeah, we can expect them, but let's look whether or not they are really critical. Because we have things like removed xml.escape, use html.escape. So we just use different class here. Then we have different literal. Then we have another change that just changes a class name. So those are the changes that are really easy to just use in your code. Your code is really easy to update, usually. Because sometimes, when low-level things change, your libraries may break. And libraries in Crystal are called shards. And shards are the same as gems in Ruby. So, you know, they are distributed and you can use them. Those are pieces of code created by someone else. And we usually want that. We want our language to have a major ecosystem, which has a lot of libraries, a lot of code, which we don't have to write because it's already done for us. So let's look for those Crystal shards. And when we Google it, we get Crystal Shards official Terraria wiki, and we get World of Warcraft. And it's the same problem that Ruby has, because if you use Ruby and then you look for capybara, unless you specifically say, hey, I want capybara Ruby, you will end up looking at cute animals. Okay, but we finally arrived at Crystal Shards website. And there is basic search box, and then we have 2,600 total shards. Is it a lot? Is it not a lot? For comparison, we have over 100,000 gems in Ruby. So Crystal has still a lot of way to go. But on the other side, like, most of those gems are garbage, like they are either abandoned or useless or not working at all. So, let's move back one step. Because let's say we want to build something with Crystal, right? We want to build a web application, like with Sinatra. Let's follow with this example. So we have two frameworks here in trending, Amber and Lucky. One of them is like Ruby on Rails, one of them is more like Sinatra. They try to do your web stack and you can just create web applications with it. But is doing what you can do with Rails, is it worth it? Like, you know, Rails is pretty good. It may have its drawbacks, but it does its job. So should we bother? Maybe not. So let's look at other things. If you want some background processing, you get sidekick.cr. This .cr means that this shard is inspired by its Ruby version. It's even created by the same person. Then you have minitest.cr if you want to have the same experience as with Ruby when testing, and webmock. And if you want to use Postgres, you have driver for it. And those are all things that you can do with Ruby quite well, right? But there are things that are easier to do in Crystal. For example, C bindings. If you have a C library and you do binding in Ruby, you just have to write a lot of C code, which is not binding in Ruby. It's binding in C and then using it in Ruby. But in Crystal, you actually bind the code inside Crystal using Crystal code, which is really nice because you can read the code later. And for example, Crystal Fun. Fun is library for neural networks, and it's a wrapper for it, and you can use it in Crystal. So Crystal is kind of moving into area where Ruby was afraid to go because it was either too slow or just hard to work. Okay, so the last thing we usually want are some tools because, you know, we have to somehow create the application. We need our favorite editor, right? And we want our favorite editor to support the language. So we got editor plugins for Atom, Vim, Emacs, Visual Studio Code, whatever we're using. And it has syntax highlighting, linters, so basic stuff is already covered. We don't have to worry about it. But then, what if we say, hey, we don't want to create another web application with it, because we have Rails for it. We want to build something better. Like, let's say this language is compiled. So we can probably build some desktop applications. Why not try it? And then you just write your desktop application. By the way, Crystal has some nice wrappers for your graphical interface binding. And you create your application, and you want to distribute it to the client. So how do you do it? You want to compile it, and the best thing would be to include Crystal libraries within the application. So yeah, Crystal compiler can do static linking, but for some reasons, it doesn't work on macOS, so you have to do it on Linux. And then, if you want to ship it to your client, it won't work on Windows either, because, you know, Crystal has no support for Windows yet. And this issue was created in 2013, which is half a year before the first release of Crystal. But the good thing is that it's now getting a lot of attention. It's the main focus in current iteration, so we should see it quite soon. And okay, so to answer the question, is Crystal ready or is it not? Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because when working in web development, we often use tools that are 0.1, and we say, yeah, this looks quite ready. Let's use it. This is the future, guys. And yeah, this is kind of similar, right? Maybe don't create your biggest application, your core of your application, but you know, some side project or something fun to hack around with. This is really good language because you know the basic syntax, and you can just try playing with it. And the good thing is, because the community is still small, you have a chance to build something bigger. You can create your own shard, which is still missing from from the ecosystem, or you can contribute to the whole community or to the language itself, because they are probably looking for developers who are doing something with the language and see some errors and want to help with them. If you want to read again about what I just said to you and rethink it, this talk is available as a blog post under this address, and we will probably post on Daft Code's Facebook slides that you just saw. If you have any questions, you can ask them now.
Hi, I have a question. Have you built anything that ends Albo powtórzysz to. Have you built anything and run in production that makes the money?
Have I run anything that makes money in production, in Crystal? No. Like, everything I've made in Crystal was just a side project or me playing around with the tools available just to know the language. Like, recently, I was also wondering, is this project still alive? So I don't have a lot of experience with this. It's like, a few months. So, and it was not a serious programming. It was just a side project, so nothing big.
Have you made anything in production that makes money outside of Crystal?
Yeah, I guess.
Just a joke. Sorry.
That's what I heard, that some of code I write make money.
Well done.
Have you got any performance tests Crystal against Ruby?
Okay. Have I compared Crystal and Ruby in terms of performance? Yeah, like when doing those projects, I was often taking parts of it and training it in Ruby and in Crystal, which is quite easy, right? You just change a few things in syntax and it works in Ruby or in Crystal. So you can compare, and it's usually, like even with basic things like create a class and do something in this class, it's about 10 times faster for Crystal. So it's quite a good gain in terms of speed. And even bigger gain is visible in memory usage, because Ruby applications, as we've heard earlier, can grow pretty fast. We can have problems with memory, but since Crystal is compiled, it manages its memory a lot better, because it knows when objects are not needed. It has a lot more knowledge about how object behaves. So that's another gain in terms of speed and in terms of memory usage.
Okay. So, all right. So the main reason I should use Crystal, from what you said, is first is performance. Second, you said just now that it's memory management. But MRI and Ruby has a lot of disadvantages. One of them is performance, but the other one is concurrency. So do you know what's the concurrency model in Crystal? How can we develop multi-threaded applications?
Yeah. So right now, Crystal uses something which is similar to Golang. It uses fibers, which are really lightweight kind of threads. But they also aim to take it a step further and make a real concurrency when you can have multi-threading, because those fibers are kind of pretending to be real thread, but they are not. So apart from creating Windows version of Crystal, the core team is also focusing on improving concurrency.
Okay, maybe you could just say it and then maybe I'll repeat it, okay?
Sure. You don't want to mock. What about the compilation times? Is it long? Is it short? I'm a bit afraid. When I was touching Crystal, it took a long time, like compared to the code size to compile.
Okay, the question is about how is compilation time, because it used to be slow, and it's still kind of slow, because Crystal still have problems with partial compilations. So when you change just a part of your code, like one class, it usually will just rebuild the whole project. So that's not good, because if you use any language that is already production ready, it should be able to just recompile the part that you just changed. So it's much faster to develop. But since we should not build really big applications with Crystal yet, because if anything changes, it may take a long time to update our code, I think it's not a big deal right now.
Okay, I think it's a good time to say that the rest of the questions should probably be directed at Maciej during our second part of the meeting, which is the social one downstairs at the bar. To chyba mogę już przejść na polski, także dzięki wielkie jeszcze raz.